What is net zero? We've heard it bandied about quite a lot. A lot of companies really are targeting net zero. We have a lot of claims of carbon neutrality. So these are all targets, right? So measuring emissions, getting your GHG inventory, that's one thing. Reducing them is another. But how do we make sure that these companies or these entities are really all on the same page? How do we make sure that there's no greenwashing involved? How do we make sure that one person's net zero is the same as another person's net zero? And that's really when some of these international frameworks come into play, such as the Science Based Target Initiative, or SBTI. Now, this really is geared towards corporates, but it can be applied to a scope of other sectors that really want to take part in this pathway to decarbonization. So this SBTI provides a framework, again, for corporates really who wish to take climate action, making sure that net zero means the same thing across all these different entities and grounding that in the latest climate science and pathways, such as those, of course, that are in the IPCC AR6. So SBTI defines net zero as two primary things. One, we are reducing scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, so that whole scope, to zero or a residual level consistent with reaching global net zero emissions, or at a sector level in eligible 1.5 degree aligned pathways. What does that mean? The easy answer is we try to get everything to zero, but we know that some sectors are harder to do that for than others. For example, chemicals or heavy industries. In order to look at what are the potential pathways, we have a number of climate scenarios that have been generated globally. IPCC in part does this. And we look at certain sectors and looking at what level of emissions they need to be by 2050 in order to contribute to a global net zero scenario. So not necessarily zero, but maybe at a certain level where we can address those emissions. And we'll talk about that later in abatements and removals. But hitting these targets and making sure that everybody, again, is on the same page and on these same pathways and scenarios. And the second aspect of that is permanently neutralizing any residual emissions at the net zero target year and any emissions released into the atmosphere thereafter. So again, it's very difficult to get completely to zero. There will be still residual emissions even at 2050, and we need to find ways to permanently neutralize those. So again, while the SBTI provides a framework for companies, it can be applicable for, say, SMEs. It can be applicable for NGOs. And what's really nice about this framework is, while it is geared towards corporates, it still uses that science-based method, and it still uses the latest science and these latest scenarios and latest pathways. So for other sectors, whether it's NGO or whether it's government, we can still take a look at this framework, at these targets, and provide input into them, whether it's a government providing policy support to help companies reach these targets, or whether that's an NGO providing means or technologies or nature-based solutions to help these corporates reach these same targets, or whether it's even schools or the academia to even just educate on what are emissions, what are targets, what are these scenarios, what technology or research gaps do we need in order to hit them, because there's still a lot of questions. It's one thing to have a target, it's another thing entirely to figure out the direct pathway to get to that target. So again, how do we get from where we are now with our full GHG inventory? Say we've understood and we've taken inventory of our scopes 1, 2, and 3. How do we get to net zero? So the SBTI outlines essentially 4 main steps. 3 are required, 1 is recommended in order to hit that level. If you look at the graph, we at the far left is currently where we are, right? Our current state of society where we're emitting a certain level of emissions annually. We want to reach and we want to taper that down through a series of abatements. So we want to reduce the amount of emissions we directly produce year on year until we reach net zero. The way we reach net zero, again, is a little bit of a mix of abatement, so reducing the amount of emissions that we produce, and then also physically removing emissions from the atmosphere, because again, we will still have some residual emissions towards the tail end as we get closer to 2050. So the 4 main steps. 1, we do need to set a near-term science-based target. So we're looking at between 5 to 10 years for this particular target. And the importance of this is to make sure that as we look at 2050, which is very hard for a lot of people and even businesses to imagine how many years down the line, it really helps to have a near-term target and make sure that we're making progress, especially in the critical years before things start to build up and get a little bit too late. This also is very important for certain sectors that need to decarbonize faster than others, specifically the energy sector. Again, as we're burning fossil fuels, we need to phase out these fossil fuels a lot faster compared to, for example, harder to abate sectors such as the chemicals industry. So a near-term science-based target is critical and an important first step, especially for companies that are willing to take and interested in taking climate action immediately. The second important thing is, again, setting that longer-term science-based target. We want to keep everything within a scenario of we're limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. So that long-term target really helps build towards net zero, because by 2050, we need to have a plan to get to that level. The third thing is recommended. It's not necessarily required, but looking beyond our value chains, right? So beyond the scopes 1, 2, and 3, how else can we help reduce emissions? So sort of beyond the scope of our immediate impact is something companies and entities, NGOs, other sectors can already start taking a look at. There are some options for this, maybe using the REDD+ framework, so reforesting certain areas, or even using new technologies such as direct air capture or DAC in order to actively sequester carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And the last thing, of course, is when GHG is released into the atmosphere. So when we've hit that SBT down the road, 2050, we're at net zero, we still have some residual emissions left over in our operations. These need to be counterbalanced through permanent removals and storage of carbon from the atmosphere. So again, we're looking at very similar technologies, maybe DACs, nature-based solutions, reforestations, but using them to very directly counterbalance our residual emissions. So we now have our inventory. So we've understood and identified our scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We now have a target through international frameworks such as the SBTI, built on the latest climate scenarios and the latest climate science through reports such as the AR6 from IPCC. Now, the hard part is, how do we get from where we are to that target? And these are where the number of different technologies and pathways and innovations really come into play. How do we decarbonize, and what are the solutions we need in order to abate and remove these emissions? So decarbonization pathways are very, very contextual and highly specific. They will change from entity to entity. They will change from country to country. But overall, some key technologies and some key pathways are going to remain pretty consistent. The first being sustainable energy. And this, again, really ties back to the bulk of the cause of climate change in the first place, fossil fuels. How do we shift the energy that we use into more sustainable technologies? There's some easy answers such as solar and wind, which now provide not just renewable and sustainable and clean energy, but actually also the cheapest power that's ever been available to mankind. So there are some financial impacts and benefits as well with transitioning our energy systems. So we can think of this in a large scale, looking at transitioning our entire energy systems and energy sectors. And this is really a whole of country approach to do this. And we can also look at a more individual level, where as a company, you can install rooftop solar, or even as a household, you can install rooftop solar in order to decarbonize or shift our energy usage into more sustainable modes of energy. We can also look at very direct technology changes. So again, going back to the causes of emissions, a large one, especially in the Philippines, is the transport sector. In our transport sector, we primarily rely on petrol-based technologies, primarily gas and diesel. We now have new emerging technologies such as EVs, which are a potential source of a potential pathway to cleaning this particular sector, which again really ties back to that first one, where you have an EV, but you also need to be able to charge it with renewable energy. So outside of EVs, there are a number of different technology changes we can make, such as very simply switching to LEDs, using energy more efficiently. So rather than changing the source of energy, just using less of it. And we can do that across a number of different sectors, whether that's the industrial sector or even at the grid level. And there are a number of different technology pathways for that as well. And that, again, will really, really vary from context to context. And then lastly, we also have nature-based solutions or other methods available to not just reduce emissions directly, but to sequester carbon that's already been emitted into our atmosphere. The easiest way of doing it existed long before humans. plants and trees and flora naturally sequester carbon, and they're a really easy way. And doing that properly, again, through all these international frameworks such as REDD+, are a great way of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. The role of innovation in this cannot be understated as well. There's a lot we don't know about how we plan on sequestering carbon, whether that's through direct air capture or whether that's through growing algae and sinking it in order to sequester it in their seabeds. There's a whole number of different solutions that we haven't explored yet, that we haven't got at the market, and the role of innovation will really help us get from where we are now to 2050. There really is a lot of unanswered questions, but hopefully, and we're very confident that with continued support and again, using a whole global approach to solving climate change, that we will get there.